Agathocles, tyrant of Sicily, who attained greatness equal to that of the elder Dionysius, rose to royal dignity from the lowest and meanest origin. He was born in Sicily, his father being a potter, and he spent his youth not more honorable than his birth, for being remarkable for beauty and gracefulness of person, he supported himself a considerable time by submitting to the infamous lust of others. When he had passed the years of puberty, he transferred his services from men to women. Having thus become infamous with both sexes, he next changed his way of life for that of a robber. Some time after, having gone to Syracuse and been received as a citizen among the other inhabitants, he was long without credit, appearing to have as little of property to lose as he had of character to blacken. At last, enlisting in the army as a common soldier, he showed himself ready for every kind of audacity, his life being then not less distinguished by restlessness than it had previously been by infamy. He was noted for activity in the field and for eloquence in making harangues. In a short time, accordingly, he became a centurion, and soon after a tribune. In his first campaign against the people of Aetna, he gave the Syracusans great proofs of what he could do. In the next, against the Campanians, he excited such hopes of himself throughout the army that he was chosen to fill the place of the deceased general Damescon, whose wife, after the death of her husband, he married, having previously had a criminal connection with her. And, not content that from being poor he was suddenly made rich, he engaged in piracy against his own country. He was saved from death by his companions, who, when apprehended and put to the torture, denied his guilt. Twice he attempted to make himself sovereign of Syracuse, and twice he was driven to exile. By the Mergentines, with whom he took refuge in his banishment, he was first, from hatred to the Syracusans, made praetor, and afterwards general-in-chief, in war which he conducted for them. He both took the city of the Leontines, and proceeded to besiege his native city of Syracuse. When Hamilcar, the general of the Carthaginians, being entreated to aid it, laid aside his hatred as an enemy, and sent a body of troops thither. Thus, at one and the same time, Syracuse was both defended by an enemy with the love of a citizen, and attacked by a citizen with the hatred of an enemy. But Agathocles, seeing that the city was defended with more vigor than it was assailed, entreated Hamilcar, through his deputies, to undertake the settlement of a peace between him and the Syracusans, promising him particular services in return for the favor. Hamilcar, induced by such hopes and by dread of his power, made an alliance with him, on condition that whatever assistance he furnished Agathocles against the Syracusans, he himself should receive as much for the augmentation of his power at home. Not only peace, in consequence, was procured for Agathocles, but he was also appointed praetor at Syracuse, and he then swore to Hamilcar that he would be faithful to the Carthaginians, the sacred fires at the same time being set forth and touched by him. Some time after, having received from Hamilcar 5,000 African troops, he put to death the most powerful of the leading citizens, and then, as if intending to remodel the constitution, he ordered the people to be summoned to an assembly in the theater, convoking the Senate in the meantime in the gymnasium, as though he designed to make some previous arrangements with them. His measures being thus taken, he sent troops to surround the people and caused the Senate to be massacred, and when he had finished the slaughter of them, cut off the richest and boldest of the commoners. These things being done, he made choice of troops and embodied a regular army, with which he suddenly attacked several of the neighboring cities when they were under no apprehension of hostilities. He also disgracefully harassed, with the connivance of Hamilcar, certain allies of the Carthaginians, who, in consequence, sent complaints to Carthage, not so much against Agathocles as against Hamilcar, accusing the former indeed as an oppressor and tyrant, but the latter as a traitor, by whom the possessions of their allies under a settled compact were betrayed to the bitterest of enemies. For, as at first Syracuse, a city always hostile to the Carthaginians and a competitor with Carthage for the dominion of Sicily, was delivered to Agathocles as a bond of union with Hamilcar, so at the present time the cities of the allies of Carthage were given up to the same tyrant under pretense of making peace. They warned them, therefore, that these proceedings would shortly come home to themselves, and that they would feel what mischief they had brought, not more upon Sicily than upon Africa itself. At these complaints the Senate was incensed against Hamilcar, but as he was in command of the army, they gave their votes concerning him secretly, and caused their several opinions, before they were openly read, to be put in an urn and sealed up, until the other Hamilcar, the son of Gisco, should return from Sicily. But the death of Hamilcar prevented all effects from these subtle contrivances, and suppressed judgments, and he, whom his fellow citizens had unjustly condemned unheard, was freed from danger of punishment by the kindness of destiny. The proceeding furnished Agathocles with a pretext for making war on the Carthaginians. His first engagement was with Hamilcar, the son of Gisco, by whom he was defeated, and retired to Syracuse to prepare himself for war with fresh vigor. But the result of his second encounter was the same as that of the first. The victorious Carthaginians, in consequence, invested Syracuse with a close siege. Agathocles, perceiving that he was neither a match for them in the field, nor provided for enduring a blockade, and being deserted, moreover, by his allies, who were disgusted by his cruelties, resolved to transfer the war into Africa. A resolution formed with wonderful audacity, that he should make war on the city of a people for whom he was not a match in his own city, that he, who could not defend his own country, should invade that of others, and that one who had been conquered should brave his conquerors. Nor was the secrecy of his plan less striking than the contrivance of it, stating merely to the people that, quote, he had found out a way to victory, and that they had only to prepare their minds to endure a short siege, or that if any of them were dissatisfied with their present circumstances, he gave them full liberty to depart. End quote. He proceeded, after 1,600 had left him, to furnish the rest with provisions and money for the necessities of a blockade, taking away with him only 50 talents for present use, and intending to get further supplies rather from his enemies than from his friends. He then obliged all the slaves that were of age for war, after receiving their freedom, to take the military oath, and put them and the greater part of the soldiers on ship, supposing that, as the condition of both was made equal, there would be mutual emulation and bravery between them. In the 7th year of his reign, therefore, accompanied by his 2 grown-up sons, Archagatus and Heraclides, he directed his course towards Africa, not one of his men knowing whither he was sailing, but while they all supposed that they were going to Italy or Sardinia for plunder, he landed his army on the coast of Africa, and then for the first time made known his intentions to them all. He reminded them in what condition Syracuse was, quote, for which there was no other remedy but that they should inflict on the enemy the distresses that they themselves were suffering. Wars were conducted in one way at home and in another abroad. At home, a people's only support was what the resources of their country supplied. But abroad, the enemy might be beaten by their own strength, while their allies fell off, and from hatred of their long tyranny looked about for foreign aid. End quote. To this was added that the cities and fortresses of Africa was not secured with walls or situated on eminences, but lay in level plains without any fortifications, and might all be induced by fear of destruction to join in the war against Carthage. A greater war in consequence would blaze forth against the Carthaginians from Africa itself than from Sicily, as the forces of the whole region would combine against a city greater in name than in power, and he himself would thus gain from the country the strength which he had not brought into it. Nor would victory be only in a small degree promoted by the sudden terror of the Carthaginians, who, astonished at such daring on the part of their enemies, would be in utter consternation. Besides, there would be the burning of country houses, the plundering of fortresses and towns that offered resistance, and siege laid to Carthage itself. From all which disasters they would learn that the wars were predictable not only from them against others, but for others against them. By these means the Carthaginians might not only be conquered, but Sicily might be delivered from them, for they would not continue to besiege Syracuse when they were suffering from a siege of their own city. Nowhere else, therefore, could war be found more easy, or plunder more abundant, for if Carthage was taken, all Africa and Sicily would be the prize of the victors. The glory, too, of so honorable an enterprise would be so celebrated throughout all the ages, that it could never be buried into oblivion, for it would be said that they were the only men in the world who had carried abroad against their enemies a war which they could not withstand at home, who, when defeated, had pursued their conquerors and besieged the besiegers of their own city. They ought all accordingly to prosecute with equal courage and cheerfulness and enterprise, than which none could offer them a more noble reward if they were victorious, or a greater honour to their memory if they were conquered. By these exhortations the courage of the soldiers was excited, but the superstitious influences of an omen had spread some dismay among them, for the sun had been eclipsed during their voyage. But with regard to this phenomenon, Agathocles was at no less pains to satisfy them than he had been with regard to the war, alleging that, if it had happened before they set out, he should have thought it a portent unfavourable to their departure, but since it had occurred after they had set sail, its signification was directed against those to whom they were going. Besides, he said, the eclipses of the heavenly bodies always presaged a change in the present state of things, and it was therefore certain that an alteration was foretold in the flourishing condition of the Carthaginians and in their own adverse circumstances. Having thus pacified his soldiers, he ordered all the ships, with the consent of the army, to be set on fire, in order that the means of flight being taken away, they might understand that they must either conquer or die. While they were devastating the country wherever they went, and laying farmhouses and fortresses in ashes, Hanno advanced to meet them with 30,000 Carthaginians. When they came to battle, 2,000 of the Sicilians and 3,000 of the Carthaginians, with their general himself, were left on the field. By this victory the spirits of the Sicilians were elated, and those of the Carthaginians depressed. Agathocles, taking advantage of his success, stormed several towns and forts, took a vast quantity of plunder, and killed many thousands of the enemy. He then pitched his camp at the distance of 5 miles from Carthage, that they might view from the walls of the city the destruction of their most valuable possessions, the devastation of their lands, and the burning of their houses. At the same time, a great rumor of the destruction of the Carthaginian army and of the capture of the cities was spread throughout all of Africa. And astonishment fell upon everyone, wondering how so sudden a war could have surprised so great an empire, especially from an enemy already conquered. This wonder was gradually changed into contempt for the Carthaginians, and not long after, not only the populace of Africa, but the most eminent cities, out of fondness for change, revolted to Agathocles, and furnished the victorious army with corn and money. To these disasters of the Carthaginians, and as if to crown their evil fortune, was added the destruction of their army and its general in Sicily. For after the departure of Agathocles from the island, the Carthaginians, prosecuting the siege of Syracuse with less vigor, were reported to have been utterly cut off by Antander, the brother of Agathocles. The fortune of the Carthaginians, therefore, being similar at home and abroad, not only their tributary towns, but even princes that were in alliance with them, began to fall off, estimating the obligations of confederacy not by the standard of honor, but by that of fortune. Among these was Ophellus, king of Cyrene, who, grasping with extravagant hopes at the dominion of all of Africa, made an alliance with Agathocles through ambassadors, arranging that, when the Carthaginians were subdued, the government of Sicily should fall to Agathocles, and that of Africa to himself. But when he came, accordingly, with a numerous army to take a share in the war, Agathocles, after throwing him off his guard by the affability of his address and the abjectness of his flattery, and, after they had supped together several times, and he had been adopted by Ophellus as a son, he put him to death, and taking the command of his forces, defeated the Carthaginians, who were renewing the war with all their might, in a second great battle, but with much loss to both armies. At this result of the contest, such despair was felt by the Carthaginians that, had not a mutiny occurred among the troops of Agathocles, Bomilcar, the Carthaginian general, would have gone over to him with his army. For this treachery he was nailed to a cross by the Carthaginians in the middle of the forum, that the place which had formerly been the distinguished scene of his honours might also bear testimony to his punishment. Bomilcar, however, bore the cruelty of his countrymen with such fortitude that from his cross, as if he had been on a judgment seat, he inveighed against the injustices of the Carthaginians, upbraiding them sometimes with having cut off Hanno on a false charge of aspiring to sovereignty, sometimes with having banished the innocent Gisco, and sometimes with having secretly condemned his uncle Hamilcar merely because he wished to make Agathocles their ally rather than their enemy. After uttering these charges with a loud voice in a numerous assembly of the people, he expired. Agathocles, meanwhile, having overcome all opposition in Africa, left the command of his army to his son Archagatus, and went back to Sicily, thinking that all he had done in Africa was as nothing, if Syracuse was still to be besieged. For after the death of Hamilcar, the son of Gisco, a fresh army had been sent thither by the Carthaginians. Immediately on his arrival, all the cities of Sicily, having previously heard of his achievements in Africa, unanimously submitted to him, and being thus enabled to drive the Carthaginians from Sicily, he made himself master of the whole island. Returning afterwards to Africa, he was received by his army in a state of mutiny, for the discharge of their arrears of pay had been deferred by the son till the arrival of his father. Summoning them, therefore, to a general assembly, he proceeded to pacify them with soothing words, saying that, quote, pay was not to be asked of him, but to be taken from the enemy, that they must gain a common victory and common spoil, and that they must continue to support him for a short time, till what remained of the war was finished, as they were certain that the capture of Carthage would satisfy all their desires. End quote. The mutiny being thus allayed, he led the army after an interval of some days against the camp of the enemy, but commencing an engagement too rashly, lost the greater part of his forces. Retreating to his camp, therefore, and finding the odium of his rash engagement affecting his character, and dreading at the same time a revival of the former murmurs at his failures in paying their arrears, he fled from his camp at midnight, attended only by his son, and when the soldiers heard of his departure, they were in no less consternation than if they had been captured by the enemy, exclaiming that they had been twice deserted by their leader in the midst of the enemy country, and that the care of their lives had been abandoned by him, by whom not even their burial should have been neglected. As they were going to pursue Agathocles, they were met by some Numidians, and returned to the camp, but not without having seized and brought back Archagatus, who, through mistaking his way in the night, had been separated from his father. Agathocles, with the ships in which he had returned from Sicily, and the men that he had left to guard them, arrived safe at Syracuse, affording a signal instance of dishonorable conduct, a prince deserting his army, and a father abandoning his children. In Africa, meanwhile, after the flight of Agathocles, his soldiers, making a capitulation with the enemy and putting to death the sons of Agathocles, surrendered themselves to the Carthaginians. Archagatus, when he was going to be killed by Archelaus, a former friend of his father, asked him what he thought of Agathocles would do to the children of him by whom he was rendered childless. Archelaus replied that he felt no concern, since he knew that his children would certainly survive those of Agathocles. Some time after, the Carthaginians sent new commanders to Sicily to terminate what remained of the war there, and Agathocles made peace with them on equal terms. Agathocles, sovereign of Sicily, having been concluding a peace with the Carthaginians, reduced, by force of arms, a part of the cities which, presuming upon their strength, had thrown off their allegiance to him. Then, as if he were confined within too narrow limits in an island, a part of the dominion of which, even when he first began to rise, he could scarcely have hoped to obtain, he proceeded after the example of Dionysius, who had subdued many of the cities of Italy, to cross over into that country. His first enemies there were the Bruti, who, at that period, seemed to have been the bravest and most powerful people of the country, and to have been extremely ready to attack their neighbors, for they had driven the inhabitants of many of the Greek cities from Italy, and had conquered in war the Lucanians, their founders, and made peace with them on equal terms. Such being the fierceness of their nature, that they had no respect even for those to whom they owed their origin. The Lucanians were accustomed to breed up their children with the same kind of education as the Spartans, for from their earliest boyhood they were kept in the wild among the shepherds, without any slaves to attend them, and even without clothes to wear or to sleep upon. From their first years they might be accustomed to hardiness and spare diet, having no intercourse with the city. Their food was what they took in hunting, and their drink milk or water. Thus were they prepared for the toils of war. 50 of these people, who at first used to plunder the lands of their neighbors, but who, as numbers flocked to join them, increased in strength and were tempted by hopes of greater booty, disturbed the whole of the neighboring country, and Dionysius, the tyrant of Sicily, being wearied of complaints from his allies, had sent 600 Africans to put a stop to their ravages. But the marauders, having seized a fort which the Africans had built, and which was betrayed into their hands by a woman named Bruttia, proceeded to build a city there for the shepherds, who, at the report of a new settlement, came in numbers to join them. And from the name of the woman they were called Bruti. Their first war was with the Lucanians, from whom they sprung. Encouraged by a victory over them, and making peace on equal terms, they subdued the rest of their neighbors by force of arms, and acquired in a short time such extraordinary strength that they were thought formidable even by princes. After some time, Alexander, king of Epirus, crossed into Italy with a great army to the aid of the Greek cities, and was cut off by them with all his force. And their natural fierceness, increased by this success, was for a long time terrible to all of them. At last, Agathocles, being importuned to come over, set sail with the hope of enlarging his dominions from Sicily to Italy. At the first news of his arrival, the Bruti, alarmed at his name, sent ambassadors to solicit alliance and friendship with him. Agathocles, inviting them to an entertainment that they might not see his army shipped over, and appointing the next day for giving them audience, went off immediately after the banquet in a vessel, and left them in a lurch. But what followed this deceit was unhappy for him, for the violence of a disease which he contracted obliged him a few days after to return to Sicily. Being affected by the distemper of his whole body, and a pestilential humour spreading through all his nerves and joints, he was tormented, as it were, by an intestine war among all his members. As his life was despaired of, a contention arose between his son and grandson, each claiming the right of succession to his power as if he were already dead. And the grandson, after killing the son, got possession of the supreme dignity. Agathocles, therefore, when the pain of his disease and his anxiety of mind were growing intolerable, the one being increased by the severity of the other, resolved on embarking his wife Texena and 2 infant sons that he had with her, with all his treasure and servants and regal furniture, in which no king at the time was richer, and sending her back to Egypt, from whence he had received her, fearing that they would not find the usurper of his power their enemy. His wife, however, long entreated that she might not be separated from her sick husband, that the affliction of her departure might not be added to the atrocities of his grandson, and that she might not be made to appear as cruel in forsaking her husband as he in attacking his grandfather, saying that, by marrying him, she not only engaged to share his good fortune, but all his fortune, nor would she unwillingly purchase, with the hazard of her own life, the privilege of receiving her husband's last breath, and of performing, with all care of conjugal duty and affection, the last offices at his funeral, which, when she was gone, no one would take upon himself to discharge. The little children, at parting, embraced and clung to their father with doleful lamentations, while the wife, who was to see her husband no more, could not desist from kissing him. Nor were the tears of the old man less moving. The children wept for their dying father, the father for his banished children. They bewailed the forlorn condition of their parent, a sick old man. He lamented that his offspring, born to the prospect of a throne, should be left in want. At the same time, the whole palace resounded with the cries of those who were witnesses to so cruel a separation. The necessity for departure, however, at length put a stop to their weeping, and the death of the prince followed the leave-taking of his children. During these occurrences, the Carthaginians, learning the state of affairs in Sicily, and thinking that an opportunity was afforded them of securing the whole island, crossed over to it with a great force and reduced several cities.